Welcome everyone to Coursera YouTube Masterclass. It's college courses for your own college experience, and if you're at a university or an institution and need extra units to pick up towards your film class, well, this is film studies at USC, Calarts, and Harvard. At USC, Calarts, and Harvard, it's an adjunct professor, and in each of those jobs I had to fill it out to become that. But in my case, I was lucky that I was studying at those universities too and was able to take all the steps in terms of the precautions you have to take and the recommendation, the prerequisites. And once you take a lot of courses on the graduate level, you can surmise that you've got the courses you need for your career. And that's when you know your PhD is coming close, is that you have all taken all the courses you possibly can in your career. And get this, Coursera is great because they encourage more classes than less in PhD program. And you kind of have to learn about everything when you're getting a PhD anyway. You kind of have to learn about every subject and read every subject, especially in relation to your own. And so then I took the steps of becoming a Masterclass professor, and it actually was weird because I was told by Masterclass about a year before I even started teaching with it that I had the job and that I could have started right away. So I could have started a year earlier, but don't worry about it. I wasn't as experienced. And of course, that's the time track. It's now we're coming on it looking in hindsight going okay, well, all that application was real. But the point is I still have to keep the Masterclass under guidelines of USC, CalArts, and Harvard. That's why they have those guidelines and why those classes are allowed in that field. Anyone else taking the classes, kind of listening in or auditing, or I know for one school, the school downtown where I've done professor work at before, it's Colorado Mesa University. And I've seen several people that watch this masterclass from there, and it's totally allowed there. It's totally allowed anywhere that you want to do it, but it's not required. But there kind of has to be a mass comm program or a film school for it to be big enough to even carry a masterclass. But check this out. CMU actually carries the masterclass the right way, and they did what I asked, to send in the paperwork about, setting it up as a class. And they told me they were way ahead of me on that. So I didn't really worry too much. But, the point is that, we teach film studies not for really someone to get, necessarily get use out of it for, applying to, how I brush my teeth. You can see that in a movie. And instructional videos are not exactly what we're talking about. But we could talk about an instructional video, and it'd be funny for there to be a goofy instructional video, But ultimately, it's just because you're not learning a skill from watching a movie necessarily doesn't mean you're not having a fulfilling experience that we believe in cinema. So what do we believe in cinema that suddenly makes it the right thing to do? Well, entertainment is our first justification of the art world of cinema, and all the definitions of why art go into philosophy and intermingle with the idea that something's underneath the image, or something's below the image, or something's above the image that's altering how we would psychologically compose the image in our mind. And there's always an image that has another image related to it, even if they aren't used together, but they're commonly seen together as symbolic. So if we have all these crises about why we do something for the aesthetic world, well, we can prove cinema is aesthetic. So if we can prove cinema is aesthetic, then we can prove that there is a need for it, because we have already admitted we need aesthetics. So if we need aesthetics in our lives, that's because we like art and categorization and genre and authorship and all the original things you can do with an artwork. You can make an artwork on a piece of wood. You can make an artwork on a rock. Or you could do it on a computer and go super fast and make these, these big errors into monster men. And they become even crazier. And it's you play these games with a multimedia atmosphere as a creator anyway, so that if it becomes something nowadays, in the postmodern sense as a movie, then it's different than the way they used to look at movies in the old days, but because now the entertainment has justified it all as useful. And entertainment's the easiest way to justify aesthetics, Only aesthetics is like saying, I can tell that this is more beautiful than the rest. You know? Like, I can tell Citizen Kane is a standout film above all the others in the rest. And the reason I can tell this is because I studied film aesthetics. And some people might say that's totally bunk and say, you can't tell just because a movie has a good set, it's a good movie. And actually, that's not true. A good set, excuse me, a good set always makes a good movie. I mean, you look at some movies that are stagey and have a good set. I mean, Oklahoma's not a bad movie, you know. Leonard Maltin gives it a good score. And then it's a little stagey. Yeah, it's pretty right off the stage. It looks like it's the same play. But that they weren't doing it to really, they were doing it for entertainment purposes, but like the Broadway musical has a totally different entertainment purpose. It's like just kind of like jazz end, like ragtime, kind of like these new symbolic musics coming out in the early days of classical music theater, and they're doing like these, you know, rondos and these very like, they have these single or arias, you know. And like, I like that they're changing the medium to fit the era. But one thing that's interesting about Orson Welles is he was kind of like living in our era back then, because like he was on the radio so much in his early career that like that was like the center of like how he was creating meaning through sound. And meaning through sound proves that there's such a thing as aesthetics, because if sound can create meaning that's apart from the like dialectic of politic and the lyric, then sound can create a reaction that we're having, whether we know it or not, like even a chemical reaction in the brain. That's why Aristotle said music will heal you. Music has healing power. You know, it's medicine. Music is medicine. Because if it activates neurons and it activates things in your brain that you're going like, okay, well, I was just affected by that movie in some way. It really helped me out. I'm really doing better now that I saw someone can relate to it. This is kind of the therapeutic culture we had in the 90s or like in the 80s, you know, and we still kind of have that. Only now everybody's like die hard again. They're like, we're gonna just conquer all. And what I like about the Citizen Kane myth is kind of the same thing in cinema, but it's like he conquers all, but he gets totally conquered in the process. I mean, like he's totally like he's beating every odd as the odd beats him, you know. At every age of his life, he has to face some kind of conflict, and he beats it, kind of, but without consequence. And like that, he's got to live with all the consequences of all these choices to run his business and choices to like push his money as far as he can go. And then next thing you know, he's rosebudding it down the stair on it. You know, it's like now he's dead, and it all amounted to he took care of things, but they really took care of him too. I mean, in a bad way, like they totally crushed him down, like he was crushed. That scene where he's like barking in front of his head being big, that's just to go to the next scene where he's failing again, and like totally his ex is like drinking now, and it's this whole Citizen Kane thing of like right when he's at his greatest height, he gets fucking smacked down. And that's what they were talking about in the movie. That's what they were talking about in the movie. They're like, well, if you, the guy that's trying to frame him, he's like, if I put these pictures in, I'm going to show them to the newspaper if you don't pull out of candidacy as governor. And so he's like, well, I'm not going to pull out, but then they show the pictures and it ruins them. And I always have to think, isn't that a weird thing about us as people? How, like, if there's like a relationship, like anything goes wrong, suddenly there's like people that are like, break them up, you know? But in this one, they're using it to show how lurid it was for even a guy and girl to be in the same picture. And this shows you kind of how old-fashioned things were compared to where Orson Welles was developed already. Because he's thinking he's in the radio world, he's beaming down all these spaceships, you know. It's like he knows how to orchestrate a big kind of clash of ideas that are taking its toll on you while you're learning it's there, see? And like that's because he delivers on these shortcuts. He delivers right as it's resolved, and right as it comes back in conflict again. See, so it comes in conflict, resolves at the end of the sequence, comes back into conflict, different conflict, you know, and back into resolution after another sequence. And that's how Citizen Kane pretty much goes, because he's always beating the odds, but he's always getting beaten down by the odds. So we said that. And so we talk so much about Citizen Kane, that's all we hear, that's most people only know. about Orson Welles even in the present, because in the present we've had to rely on like these piecemeal classes like I have, where it's like, or these completely organized versions of the Orson Welles class, right? And it's like you can take any one of those and see that there's a lot of differences in the way it's taught, but that there's so much information when it comes to a movie that you could literally teach this whole class on just Citizen Kane. Like you could say that the only thing we're studying is like the irony and juxtaposition of the conflict resolution shot cuts, or the staircase scene. There's all these like scenes in that movie that are like branded out as a sequence to remember. And in that sense, it's entertaining like Casablanca because there's always a leader or a pointer kind of guiding our eyes to see the drama. The way that in Macbeth there was those ghosts passing by and they were guiding the drama, but they would keep going and your face would stay still. So then another one's going. It's like this cloud of ghosts going past you in a Shakespeare play. And I thought that was a good idea that in Falstaff they went with the non-supernatural version, because that's way more Orson Welles like, is to have like the humanist version where Chimes at Midnight is illustrating the passion for Shakespeare, but it's mostly saying that if you took one character that he repeated throughout his scripts and put them all in the right context, you'd have like one play, the Falstaff Inquirement. And he actually tried to write that, I've heard, and was banned from writing it, or so there was something about it that was like offensive in Falstaff, and so he had to ban that film for a while, and then Chimes at Midnight came out re-edited several times, and he probably didn't even know it was out. Like, I read one book with him around the time of Chimes at Midnight. I saw this book, and it was like, I mean, I didn't, but I saw this book that was written around then. And he's like saying that he doesn't even know if it went out in theaters. But, like, it must have been a good movie, he says, because a few of my friends in Hollywood are talking about it. And it's like, but he's like, and it did good business. But he's like, I never saw one theater in my life that had one of my movies on. I mean, he admitted to this. Maybe not the ones he acted in, though. Maybe he saw some of those because those were for commercial. And in commercial, we can totally justify entertainment, because entertainment is worth paying money for because it gets you a little more jostle. Which the art of it already brings about the money through the craft. Like the cinematography, the editing, all that's like part of the art form, because it's all the different modes of production you have to use to get through the pre-production, production, and post-production phase of making a movie. Because making a movie requires all kinds of different players, and we've only gone over that a little bit in Masterclass. Like the producer, who's always the leader of the film in the classical era, even in the modern, the leader of the film isn't necessarily the most authorial. See, the producer actually puts forward the engagement that the movie is going to be made. This is how we make we're going to make this movie, and here's how we're going to do it. But see, the director's the one that actually makes the movie. And if Orson Welles was more interested in directing, that's one of the reasons I think some of them have been, because producer gives you a lot of credit, but your film never looks like it does in your mind usually if you're the producer, because you have these ideals, and your ideal is is like naturalistic, or it's like hedonistically supernatural, and it's like we can expressionize it or we can close it down to a fine tune. But with the producer, they can always refine it as they go and refine the pictures, refine the ideas where to find them, refine like the screenplay itself. They can do all, like a producer is a really good luxury, because you can't really have a film without it, because you need someone pushing for the movie to get made. And there's more to it than that. There's more outs and ins. But if the director's making the movie and Orson Welles wanted to do that, it's because of the Truffaut idea that the politic of auteurs, the author is the director. And usually when we see a movie, we can kind of understand what directors kind of have sensibilities towards. Like when we watch a movie, even now, we can see what kind of a movie it is before we've even seen it, if it's by a certain director and they have like a signature style, like an auteur style. So Truffaut basically won that debate, because everybody else basically looks as the director as author. But then there's the authorship dilemma, which just kind of charges that every other job in the cinema movie of the time that they're making is actually part of the authorial context of the movie too. Like everybody kind of writes it like in a weird way. Like everybody that's in it, it's like the light that shoots by him is writing kind of a scene about the person in it, you know. So that everybody gets equal share of the credit, no, but that everybody that worked on a movie has partial authorship to the movie itself. You know, and I'm not giving away any secret. It just means that everybody that puts into it gets out what they put into it. That's the beauty of cinema. It's so, like, if you put it in there, it'll be there when you get back. If you didn't put it in there, you might go find where it's at and bring it back, you know? And we look at Orson Welles' career, though, and it's like, well, he was so gung-ho on directing that he was taking acting parts to make up for the money to make the movie directing. And he was producer on many of his films. He produced 68 films and directed 62. I have this list here that's kind of spotty and really doesn't help because I've seen different ones today, and it kind of does, but it's IMDb on Orson Welles. I'm looking at Twelfth Night, you know, we said that one, that was his first one, and then we reel it up here to like F for Fake, which is at the top. Well, actually, there's one called Don Quixote that he never got finished, and there's a Moby Dick that he was the actor in, but it lists him as a director too. So here's the thing. Assistant director and side assistant director couldn't just go to him because he was already in the Directors Guild, and he was in the Directors Guild as early as Citizen Kane, maybe even with Hearts of Age. I'm sure he could have gotten a job with them then. And I know that he did form Houseman, which turned into Mercury, but at the end, you look at it all like he's going for a Don Quixote project, trying to fight the White Whale, and is totally going down with the ship because the movie never gets made. And so these other movies he's director on, like Moby Dick, I question whether he was the actual or original director, or if because they knew he was an actor that could direct, they let him direct his own scenes or something. And that's what made him, and that's kind of it. And he then was a director in the movie, and these IMDb's kind of play it to make it look like that's one of his films. And I'm not saying they did anything wrong. They don't do anything wrong with that. That's perfect because that proves that every little bit was the authorship of the movie, and that, like in this case, he's like this gallant director still when Moby Dick comes out, but he hadn't made a movie that year, maybe. I don't know. He probably made like 10 movies a year, really. I looked it up because I said there was like 4 or 5 movies a year that were docked on his projects, and he'd usually get 1 or 2 of them out. But now it looks more like, and according to this timeline, it looks like he had about 1 to 5, because 1 movie for every 5 he had to make, and they're still showing up as a low count. But you got to understand, there's not really a sense of disappointment there is a little bit, but a movie going down that you loved and wanted to make, which is always the ones he was on. You got to realize that his dream project was the whole project, the whole context of all of his films out into F for Fake. They were all planned ahead of time. And the ones he fouled up on were kind of planned ahead of time, but we won't talk about that. But if the films of Orson Welles really compel you to look at something, it's that his perseverance in Object of Things Crashing Through mirrored the Citizen Kane spirit, that you're going to get through it, but it's going to leave a mark on you, because he didn't really have any problems with like taking studio films or films that other people were directing and finishing them, and he kind of had this interest in foreign film, you know. That's why An Unvanquished Love is so great, because he doesn't languish in anything except the cinema images, you know. He languishes only in that, or does he languish in everything, right? So Orson Welles is directing movies for these studio systems. Some of those he probably didn't even know died in the making, you know, because you don't know all the time with the movies going out and him not knowing what's on in theaters. Some he may have thought came out. You know, it wasn't that it was disorganized. It's that, like, there's so many movies coming out that people have to pay close attention when there's a director they love. And that's kind of a new thing, to go to a movie just to see the director, and Orson Welles kind of invented that, although there was Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton in the silent era where everybody wanted to see their film regardless that they directed it, and this is kind of what started the Directors Guild, was Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin and D.W. Griffith and all that. They kind of put it together because they were like, well, they're coming to see us as directors, and it's like, well, that's why we write ourselves as director too. This is all American cinema because there's other parameters in other countries. And so Orson Welles is taking this event of making his career work, and at the end, he probably had a different filmography than we're looking at. Like, he probably had some movies he knew he made, and a lot of directors do have movies that only they know about. We said that. But what's interesting is Orson Welles didn't always get taken as mainstream, although his entertainment qualities feasted forth on the box office draw, like in Magnificent Ambersons. There's so much beautiful to look at that it becomes more of a hearty film. Like, it becomes more plunny. It becomes like this production design that's really sticking forth at you, and these big tracking shots along the wall, and you're just like, this is a really built set, this is really good construction, and then you can see the point of aesthetics. But there it becomes entertaining too, because of those Broadway musical-like considerations. It's got such a big set that you gotta love it anyway. Like, it's expressionistic, it's hyperbolic, it's like everything you need a movie to be, like, bigger than life, larger than life movie. And that a lot of people were disappointed with Citizen Kane because it has a disappointing ending, because it's disappointing that he dies. So now we're all thinking, okay, so endings can be disappointing, but usually in a classical dimension, when the film ends with him dying, we feel complete and good. But since we saw him dying at the beginning, we're already freaked out. We're like, if the dude's dead and he's back, then we're just gravitating towards death. It's like a elevated to the gallows narrative, where he's just headed to the end, and at the end is death row, and that's where he goes. And, it's like, it works that way even in the censored versions, where the police pick him up at the end for polygamy or whatever, because he's got two wives, and he doesn't really even have two wives. He's divorced with the president's wife now. She's like married to the president's wife in the movie, And it's like, if he has to deal with that, then he was set up, and probably didn't notice that they were going to set him up for murder in the film, and they set up Charles Foster Kane, and they took that out in the censored version because they felt that it was too obvious that he was making love to this woman that was his new wife. And back in the 40s, as much as we say there wasn't much scandal back then, but there was, movies were so big and important that they were not really allowing people to talk about sex at that time, even though people in society could, right? Or like sexuality and sexual differences and everything. And they didn't really have that in school at the time. Like, back then it was unruly to even talk to anyone about it. So now they've got the seamy side of Citizen Kane, and it's like, since they don't show anything in it except for her and her dress and him and his like tux or whatever, they don't show anything, but something goes on from the way everybody's frazzled. And then after that, like, they're practically shooting at this guy who's coming in to kick him out of being senator. And this is from the bottom looking up through the stair set, and the guy's kind of looking down like he's going up in a Terry Gilliam shot to kill him. It's like, that must have been where Citizen Kane came in important, was politically. See, politically, the whole script is designed to overthrow, like, the idea that you're going to get overthrown. And we talked today about that, but, like, you have to realize it's like one big contraption to point out one successful businessman's life, but to show us also that the things he did to get there weren't always in everybody's interest. And if it's not in everybody's interest, then why go see it? Why go do it? And so everybody's like, oh man, that was a depressing movie. So they're not disappointed with the film and its aesthetics. They're disappointed that Charles Foster Kane never really got his break. He got his break on money, and that's about it. He didn't really he got to keep his business going, and that's beautiful. His newspaper, beautiful. But his opera company was like already like forced and obligatory. Like, he had to have that opera company to impress his wife, but he just wanted to do that to see if she could do it and impress her. And in real life, we know, she was a good actress, the real McCoy in that one. And it's like, the real Charles Foster Kane's wife was very talented. And in Citizen Kane, she's not. And so now we all have a strange memory of, like, whether or not that's the case, and that he wanted to put that in there to confuse people anyway. Orson Welles did. He wanted everyone to be confused with whether or not, like, he had killed Thomas Ince, too, and they had to take that scene out. So Joseph Mankiewicz is writing the script. And he's the one that had the idea for Citizen Kane anyway. And they'd been working on it since 1933, and like all these different people were coming on board. So it was really Orson Welles from the beginning when they incited it through War of the Worlds, and then finally he got signed on to it because he wanted to do the big movie. He wanted to do the director set, and he'd only done the avant-garde, and like this is the one they appointed him to practically, but he picked it too. Is kind of like right as that film was coming back into station because of Joseph Mankiewicz. They decided to go through with it and make it, and they did this big sets, and they got big fa-la-la sets, you know? And so it's like, all right, so now everything's steamy, and everything's rich and entertaining, and but yet so sad and alcoholic, and, you know, it's like everybody breaks down in that film like they're having a bad day, you know? It's like it's like at the beginning, they're all like hunky-dory. And then the political edge gets them all in the back. And they start, like, judging each other, and everybody's already doing that by the time politics have even entered into the film. And then like Orson Welles is at this table with his first wife, and they have this conversation that like takes like 3 years, but it's only like a 5-minute conversation. It's all the things they talked about in those 5 years in 5 minutes. And it's like they're sitting there not talking to each other from across the zone. And that's how it is when you're in business. You can't really focus on anything but your own sort of business notes. And then everything around you kind of falls apart because it needs attention too. And so it's like, well, this film is teaching you that, but it's like well known by the 1940 populace that if you get remarried, you're already going to look like a freaking scandal. You know? And so that's what we don't realize about like how soon that was ago, because that was World War II. And actually, some of the soldiers said being in Europe was what really, and brought that back, was really what encouraged more people to have like a second husband after they divorced the first, you know. It's not the end of the world. Try Citizen Kane. No, I'm just kidding. So that was a dating video for Citizen Kane, by the way. No, I'm kidding. So they have this theory that the estheticians, of course, have this theory that if you try to bury a film in just technique, that's a lot of the style. But if you only look at that and don't look at the individual aspects, like how was it edited? How was it filmed with the cinematography? How was it directed? Was the director telling the actors to walk a certain way and talk a certain way and be a certain way in the shot while he himself mapped out how the shot was going to go and they all rehearsed it? That's the professional level, and that's the level we get with Orson Welles. That Orson Welles will do these deep, long improv scenes. Like in Chimes at Midnight, most of it's straight out of Shakespeare, but there's an improv scene where he says, do what you might like it. You might like the Lord Sheldon. You might like him the way he functions in the sky. You might like him in the way he froze upon his grave. And here I am. I'm still him. I froze on my grave and I'm here. I mean, that line is so Orson Welles because like the guy went through fire and ice to get to like where he needed to go to this tavern. And all he could find was and it was like Falstaff's still saying this and the other guy's saying this, and they're looking at each other like, we're wasted. And I'm not saying in the film they were necessarily, because a lot of times they'll mediate how much they drink even when it looks like they drink a lot in a movie. Yeah, I don't know that for sure, but like if you were making a movie and you were really drinking as fast as the characters are in the scene, you'd be like plowed after like the first take, because then you're like making these scenes and everyone's like, is that boring, making like a 3-second shot and a 3-second shot and a 3-second shot? Far from boring. It's the collision with everything creative. And it's how you figure out how the film's designed. Because where you follow the camera is how the film is defining its language. And the language of a film, for instance, tracking left or right. If a film was tracking left or right, then like we read left or right. So this is a more distinct push to the right, and we're normally going that way, and it doesn't seem like there's much resistance. And then we've had a tracking shot all the way across to the right. Now, tracking shot includes the whole shot into it while it's moving, so my hands are just kind of theoretically staging it. So I think when you're devising a way to go through the story and you're building shots, you got to remember that the shots have to be approved of the Motion Picture Council if they're even Hollywood shots. And so Orson Welles was dealing a little bit with the Hollywood Council, but they gave him a lot of leeway because he had like carte blanche on Citizen Kane, which meant if he really wanted to get political with it and have the sex scene with that girl in it, that lady, and him, they probably could have done that. They probably could have done that with their carte blanche. It wouldn't have been seen by hardly anyone, but like they could have made the movie that way at least, and it probably wouldn't have gotten shelved. It probably would have come back just like it did today, because they didn't really think about it for like a couple of decades. In the 70s, in the 70s it was there, but it was like filmmaker study guide. And it became filmmaker study guide right away instead of Birth of a Nation. Like Birth of a Nation was filmmaker study guide #1 for years in cinema history. But then like Citizen Kane became more important because it was more about framing a character. And that character had more of a human personality because he's coming from theatrical means. And so we get this sense that the Orson Welles class that we've had is to kind of study this design of how to be a director. And it turns out that that's still what we're using it for most as far as Citizen Kane goes. The books on it by Laura Mulvey, the writing on it, Robert Carringer does that making of Citizen Kane. And this is the Blu-ray factor. And I already had this somewhere, but the point is that like this is Orson Welles' a vengeance upon the arts in general. He takes so many liberties from the original Motion Picture Council that they almost do cast a rationalization charge on him, that he'd have to rationalize the shot he was making and prove why scientifically, And the directors had to go through all that. Orson Welles was really like, how do I skew the issue? And other directors are telling him, When Orson Welles had kind of wanted to talk to D.W. Griffith, they never really got along because of politics. I mean, you could imagine that. But Orson Welles tried to talk to him about lowering the idea of a right-wing film being one-sided. Because he was trying to say that democracy has more than one side, so their films are more balanced. And Griffith said, well, I'm about to unbalance my film naturally. And then he knocked a bunch of logs down the hill or something. I mean, he just he didn't care. He was a gung-ho, push it forward, die for it guy, but he didn't care who he was offending. And so Citizen Kane actually has the mediation to say, well, we're going to have the left wing be right in multiple ways, but then his left-wingism will still fail him. It's like that ultimate story about the individual in a dozen societies. It's like the individual is there. He's recognized in the one society at the time. But when he goes to the other club, he's no longer at that club, and so they forget that he was ever there, and it's by how many people are there. I'm not saying that's how nightclubs work, because then I'd give away a secret and everybody would be offended that I gave it away. But what we need to talk about is how Orson Welles was a flashy entertainer, and then he's suddenly breaking down the context, deconstructing normal shots and bringing them around what Godard's going to do, and that is imagizing the image for not only the sake of itself, but for the representation of what it's showing. And this is the political matter that Joseph Mankiewicz was working out. Because you have a representation of what matters, then it's you're still telling the audience in a propaganda way what matters to you should matter to them. And that becomes a very difficult arguing point with psychology because no two people look at the same thing alike. When you're watching a movie, you see a different movie than someone else sees it. I hate to give that away. But you're seeing something different than the other person's seeing. Not just because it's a different version than what normally came out, but because you can't assimilate visuals. No two people assimilate visuals the same way. And this is proved by director construction in a movie. So if you're a constructor, as a director, you're going to give away your authorship because that's where your individuality comes through and how you direct the shots, direct where they're going. Now, Citizen Kane is modern. And all of these movies up for F for Fake are modernist movies. And they draw attention to the making of them, not because they do directors would one day watch that, but because that's what they wanted to do with the movie, make it self-reflexive. And yeah, we're passing on information, but we don't know how long it'll last as information. And then Citizen Kane kind of becomes this ultimate book this ultimate movie about itself. And so he's fashioned with the idea that he's going to build these modern images and build these kind of like modern icons, and like that they're coming out and revealing themselves off the seam, and they're coming out in pictures revealing that they need to draw attention to themselves as pictures. Then they're saying this is how we make pictures, and then they're saying this is how we draw attention to them, and now you can make pictures that draw attention to themselves. So then that's a double context, because they're making a movie on top of a movie. They're making like the making of, and it's not like the making of except applied by watching the shots and seeing, you can take the pieces apart and seeing how they were not really filmed in order, but like how they were assembled that way was already like key lock. These pictures go in a certain order, and that's the imagery. So we don't have to talk about Kane all the time either, but I like it because it's his own personal model for how to do it right the whole time. And that's what he's always saying in these like transcriptions, is that he's always using Citizen Kane as an example, and so are the teachers, because it's his one most poetic, like, and biographical, kind of autobiographical semi, about a guy who's writing a movie about another guy who's kind of like him, only Orson Welles is taking over for movies and on like a small level, on like an independent level, and Charles Foster Kane is William Randolph Hearst, and that's where he gets his newspaper tycoonship from. And so now we're looking at how individual the film is, that like Joseph Mankiewicz wrote it, but like Orson Welles' stylizing of it, directing it, is really where we get these like fancy ideas for long takes, like a longer take than 3 seconds. Like the camera records for like, longer films, longer than 3 seconds. And actually films longer than that anyway, but if you're taking a longer shot, it's harder sometimes to even employ those shots at all. Like it's hard to employ something that doesn't belong. In fact, that's one thing that is a strength about Hollywood classical cinema, is they always, mostly, this could be a problem sometimes like Magnificent Ambersons, but mostly they deuced out the footage that wouldn't work anyway. And directors could or couldn't be in on that, but if the footage didn't work, they'd just can it. That's not really the case anymore, but it's not like because of any other reason than that first shot might have been the one we wanted, and now we can do like CGI to fix it. And it's like, CGI is not cheating on a movie. It's like, you add the like edge to it, you add the surprise to it, you add the set to it, and make it sort of full and beautiful. It looks like kind of CGI, but it's meant to be movie fantasy world. Like we're in movie fantasy world, and that's why we're seeing CGI. And really, in a sci-fi film or whatever, like I think even if Orson Welles had done War of the Worlds, he'd have a bunch of special effects. But what's interesting is Citizen Kane has a special effect in every shot, it says. Like there's a special effect being used, but mostly it's a camera effect in Citizen Kane. So really, again, you get this idea that he was the most individualist, that he's like this rugged individual making Citizen Kane against all odds, and everything's breaking down on him and he's still pushing, is kind of the Griffith story, except on the other side of Kane, there's this odd redemption of being like this modern film guru for the rest of his life. And like as an actor in all these movies, he's acting as though he were doing the part Shakespeareanly, like traditional quality, like don't draw attention to it, to really do the classical kind of acting, which is just staunch, the character he needs to be, the character he's rigid about, and that's why he's doing it. So then like, that's a great career in acting all by itself, but then you turn out to be this modern warrior of directing that as it comes back to our society now, we realize the biggest thing since Birth of a Nation was Citizen Kane. And then eventually it'll get to Pulp Fiction, and that's where we're at. I don't really think we've gone beyond Pulp Fiction. I don't think there is a beyond Pulp Fiction. I don't know. So many people are arguing, well, the Orson Welles style was in Pulp Fiction, and we're like, yeah, that's true. But it seems to be like the last representation that anyone had the most control over a movie to really go back and say, we're going to conquer all, even though we're being conquered. And this is not really the redemption they were looking for at first, because with these scripts, they were very muddy, very film noir, very like drastic, very like, car beam and headlights, like that even looks like kind of. And it's like, it was a hard-edged detective boiler when it started, Citizen Kane. He was running the detective work on what Rosebud meant. You know, and so it's like this was originally like something that he's like this detective. You never hear his name. Like you always see him from the back, and you never hear his name. And he's kind of like always at the beginning of each new scenario, defining what the conflict is, and they define this range of conflict about, and it's political in Citizen Kane. See, in Griffith, it's like the rights of man. You know, it's like Thomas Paine. It's like this is the way mankind is anyway. But like with Citizen Kane, there's like this kind of response of change that you can be a modern thinker while making modern films. This is a very hard concept to grasp, except for these films are only modern in the nostalgic sense, right? Nostalgic being homesick or wanting to go back home because you see something out that reminds you of there. And it's like you start to get this nostalgia. So I think that he was making these modernistic, nostalgic films, like Magnificent Amberson was nostalgic, you know. You had that to draw attention to the technique. That's usually what an art director would do. And the art director would take the film and really production design it out and then kind of leave the linguists their improv, or kind of, you know, set up a working Houseman version, Mercury Theater version of a Shakespeare play, you know? And so we have about 9 minutes left, and I know we went through a lot of that material fast, and it's coming down to it that we have 2 classes left, and the one that comes next week is the second to last, and we'll be on more clerical duties of setting up the final. And then the final class will hopefully last longer than my last final. I don't know if my last final is still there from whatever class, and from the Westerns class. And so I had that final, and it was kind of hanging out there that I didn't do this last lecture. So I'm just letting you know, I'm probably going to go for a full last lecture, but we may cut it short and skip out in 2 classes from now after 30 minutes of talking about what's possible to write on the final. And if you look at the next week we have is kind of a bonus week, because we're still we had enough time in this class to look at this filmography, but I'm reading these titles like Hopper Wells is the top one. Other Side of the Wind. These are all director credits. Other Side of the Wind, Moby Dick, One Man Band, It's All True, Don Quixote, Orson Welles' Magic Show. And we know if we study Orson Welles that Don Quixote was pretty much at his breaking point, was pretty much him throwing in the towel and saying, like, I know that I have more movies to direct, but it won't be like my personal visions, especially Kane, which I was carte blanche on. And you could see how that'd be individualist, because you can do everything you want to do as an implied director. So, and there's more. There's like Spirit of Charles Lindbergh, The Dreamers, filming The Trial. I mean, The Trial is another example of like a cubist film meets a pinboard discussion, because you're like, well, it's moving around these characters as though they're like marbles in a marble stadium. And it's like, you got this sort of like, you know, enclave where it's like this, you're indoors all the time in The Trial, even when you're outdoors. It feels like the whole society is kind of constructed around you. Like, say, KGB Russia. Like, they kind of surround you and they get all your information, and they listen to you. And I know that like that's something to say, and that's kind of insulting them, but I don't really care, because that's not the point. The point is, you're not supposed to live that way. You know, everybody knows that's a psychological problem that the other person's having that puts it on you. That's what The Trial is all about. It's not about like, you know, the guy going through there and he's innocent or not. He didn't really know. The Trial is more like a test to see if he even exists in this nightmare world of surrealism. And a nightmare world of surrealism is always going to be like deconstructed into like some kind of like Freudian dream. You know, and like the Freudian dream is going to take into account that genders are different. You know, and so this all scares us into saying things we don't want to. No, it scares us into saying things we do want to. Because if you're being looked at like in the Cold War as though you have like headset on and you're being followed around and you're being like paranoidically distinct from everybody, you know, but you're still paranoid, and kind of this trial, or like even like Brazil type environment where like everything's coming down on you again. But like in The Trial, they're showing something about voyeurism of like that they're showing in Touch of Evil, and that is if you record the soundtrack But ahead of time, you can have a character in the movie have that recorded on soundtrack ahead of time and play it to the person to bust them. It's the old bust them with the microphone shot. And so you're getting this idea that they're already talking about the Cold War. They're already talking about how like privacy is being invaded constantly. Like these characters have privacy invaded. And isn't a movie like a big invasion of privacy of a character, like anyway, theoretically? Because like we're invading their privacy by watching their lives go by, but we know it's a narrative film. But we've also got it in the back of our mind that something's up with this Orson Welles character who like is really iconoclastic. And like you see that's all shrouded in this idea that the man's trying to bring them down. And the trial is like the whole thing where like the thought police can hear you. The thought police hear what you think, and then they judge you for it, and then they tell you you're in trouble for having thought that, even though they generated that thought into your head. I mean, this is 1984, the book. And it's like, so we're going to have that, but yet somehow we're going to be like meticulously wondering if it's a good thing to surveil someone their whole life. I mean, Orson Welles is like critiquing this. It's like, go ahead, you're going to do it anyway. I'm just calling out the attention that you do it. That's what he was like at War of the Worlds. He's like already smashing bases because he doesn't really care what people tell him on the side that aren't professionalists. Like Orson Welles, he's listening to directors, he's listening to Griffith, he's taken interviews with directors, but really a layman doesn't know how to make a film. And you should never tell someone how to make a film if you don't know how to make one. And I think Orson Welles was trapped with that a lot. Or even if you do know how to make one, if you don't know how to make it to the director's style and director's style wins, you should know as a film contextual writer that you still give authorship to the director. And though we all know that producers produce these fantastic worlds for us to live in and see and fly through, it's great. But somebody's got to live and see and fly through it. They've got to live and see and fly through that world that the producers created. And who better than the director, which knows how to make the movie? So I don't really criticize anyone for saying they had more of a hand on a movie than another than the director. That could be true in some cases. But everybody knows that, since the director makes the movie, he can claim the authenticity or the authorial content or that it was his idea that scene was there the way it was. And this is all a trait started by Orson Welles at RKO. So he's living up to the medium's passion. He's showing us years later that we can kind of take these deconstructed shots and level out the political imagery by saying it's too hard or it's not hard enough. And we look at kind of the pessimism and optimism of a democracy, about how the populace will decide. But then when does that democracy fail? Like the trial is like the populace breaks up all around him and everybody's scared. Now the agents, the secret agents are scared because they're getting thought police registry. So it's like ultimately like the same guys that were bullying the other ones are bullying each other on accident because nobody knows who has the headset on. I'm just saying in 1984, that book is really not my favorite book, but it's a really good representation of how people felt in the blacklist, the Cold War, things that were really political that the country went through. There was some information like that, and both sides were getting damned by it. Both sides, like the blacklist was having people say they could hear other people talk or think about communism, and they're nailing them on it. And I'm like, well, if that's a government secret, it didn't get to me because they were saying it was a bad thing in film school that they blacklisted those guys and sent them to jail. And in my hometown, Dalton Trumbo is from here, so I don't want to start any crazy courage, but people thinking they hear something that someone else is thinking might need to go check themselves out and see if they're really all there. Because how can you hear someone thinking something unless you're a spy? And if you're a spy, that means you have spy equipment. That means that it's probably not from the government. If it was someone spying on you, and I'm just saying this is all things you can learn from the trial, 1984, these kind of blacklist actions. Where everybody's ratting on everybody about what they think about, but they can maybe hear each other through a microphone. And you're like, well, if I can hear you through a microphone, I still don't take you as seriously as that what you're saying unless you're talking directly to me. And then even then it's kind of clouded up because I can't see what reactions he's making to my conversation. And this is why all films of the old era have like a shot reverse shot because not everybody communicated on their technology only and used to communicate by like meeting in these drawing rooms and kind of like talking back and forth, like since the silent era. And that's not a boring shot. It's just like, wouldn't you rather like just resolve it by like texting someone, and why are these people like chasing me? It's like in the trial, it's like, don't you wish you had a cell phone in an Orson Welles movie, Because then you could like, and that's kind of what he's got in that Touch of Evil microphone. He's like, ha ha ha, I can hear you forever now. You'll be forever emblazed on cinema now, is kind of what he's acting like. And it's Orson Welles having a freaking coup de grace. He's second thought, he's having a tour of divorce throughout his whole career, that if movies fell, movies would rise. He would still come back to the next one. Idealist humanism intact, democratized only in the sense that there's a way out of this horrible plague that's coming to us all. But what the way out really means is meaninglessness of whether or not their life had happened that way, would it have ended that way too? And there's no answer to that. Conflict, resolution, unresolved. And this is part of the modern context of the films of Orson Welles. And we'll talk more next week about wrapping things up and then detailing what we can of the style points, the points to the style. It's like memories and dreams and writings that are in the film, or like songs, or like just different things that are beautiful to make a film go in terms of through the mythology of that genre are all available in all the works for Orson Welles. And like it just in different ways and at different times, and a lot more like deconstructed with the editing. So remember this as the final approaches. And I'm not going to quite give you the final till next week. I know it's unfair because I still have to kind of work on how I'm going to word it. So wish me luck, and I'll see you all next week for the Films of Orson Welles by YouTube Masterclass Coursera.